Welcome back, friends. We are I'm so excited for our next presenter. But first, let's look at this clip. Dr. Mark A. Pottinger. So excited to introduce our next presenter. Dr. Pottinger is an associate professor of musicology at Manhattan College in New York, where he also chairs the Department of Music and Theater. In Dr. Pottinger's hands, the history of music becomes a far-reaching exploration of human thoughts and ideas. Not sure what medicine, science, and Buffalo Bill have to do with music? Dr. Pottinger can tell us. A leading force in the field of sound studies, Dr. Pottinger has received numerous awards and honors, including the prestigious Berlin Prize from the American Academy in Berlin. Please send some love through the Zoom portal for Dr. Mark Pottinger.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Susan, for that wonderful introduction. I feel so sort of humbled by all of you here. I was part of the at the very beginning there at 12, and seeing so many of you just engaged directly with the act of just trying to get these young people just involved in the world of the arts, but also especially in this special art form of opera. And I just wanted to acknowledge I'm coming from northern Manhattan area known as Inwood, but it is the historic ancestral home of the Lenape people. I just wanted to acknowledge that here in this virtual world. So yeah, as Susan was saying, I'm a phenomenologist, basically. I look at the phenomenon of sound and how it relates to the human experience. So musicologist sometimes, it's a term that often feels a bit stodgy, but I try to reveal to you that I'm not stodgy, that I really love and passionate about the genre of opera and all the ideas that we'll be exploring today for the next basically 40 minutes or so. And Dan will be our help here today by playing some videos, some audio. Also have some visual aids I'll be performing for you. So hopefully this time together will be one and engaging. And for those who opera patrons, hopefully that this discussion will also be something that informs your own understanding, not only of Lucia, but of opera in general. And one of the things I've always been excited about is trying to embody sort of the sound world, sort of the space that what did the 19th century hear. Now, often in recordings, we often, this mediation of our experience is often lost in this particular recording, that recording. When there wasn't any recording devices, when there wasn't any other way to hear a performance but by buying a ticket and going into seeing that theater live. And the only way to hear it outside the theater was to go to the salon and hear almost like postcards, snippets that would be played for easy piano, or a medium piano, or for harp, or for some other instrument. So that was the only way for people to hear opera. And so we're trying to, so as a phenomenologist, I'm trying to explore that very sound world that there in the 19th century. So let's just go ahead and start right here. So at Lucia di Lammermoor, there's much to say about this work. And one of the things I'd like to say is that Donizetti, he wrote over 60 operas, altogether 66 operas, which is a massive amount of number. And he lived to only about 50 years old. And this opera, Lucia di Lammermoor, is roughly around his 30th opera and premiered in 1835, in September of 1835. And it is a work that today is one of all the operas that he wrote. This is the one that is typically seen on opera stages throughout the world. And if you don't know any Donizetti opera, most people would say that this is the one that I know. And it's all due to this final climactic moment, this mad scene. And that's one of the things we'll be talking about. And it can go into spaces that are a little bit, adult, if you will, for some of these young learners. But we're going to try to explore various ways that you can approach this as an educator that really looks at sort of the depths and sort of the different, you might say, street and byways and various ways that you can approach this work and unlock some of the areas that not just see it as a work on its own, but see it part of the students' lives themselves in their everyday experience. So this opera that is based on a libretto by Salvador Camarano, who based this libretto actually on Sir Walter Scott. And I'm going to be sharing my screen with some images here, so you don't just see my talking head. Hopefully you can all see this. This is an image of Sir Walter Scott. And he wrote the tale, The Bride of Lammermoor, which this opera is based on. Lucia de Lammermoor is based on Sir Walter Scott's novel in 1819, The Bride of Lammermoor. And what Salvador Camarano, the librettist, did by translating it, almost like a script writer, would take a film score, based on the life of another medium, another book, and translate it directly. And here in this new medium, he takes the idea of the Gothic elements in The Bride of Lammermoor, the wandering ghost, the idea of revenge, bloodlust and murder, interfamily conflict, ruined castles, and of course, female madness. So all this plays a part and translated directly in Salvador Camarano's libretto, which makes it very interesting because bel canto typically doesn't have Gothic elements. And so there's something unique about Lucia, and perhaps one of the reasons why of all the bel canto operas, those operas roughly in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, that we still see today. Rarely do we see a lot of bel canto operas, on opera stages today. There's something about this one that continues to translate to contemporary audiences, and perhaps it's that Gothic element. And it's to remember that this book, The Bride of Lammermoor, also is in the context of this interesting novel as well. Now, this is 1818, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So The Bride of Lammermoor and Frankenstein are roughly around the same time, where they reveal this genre of looking at the world of the inside that's expressed on the outside, almost as what is sometimes referred to as the Gothic sublime, where you have this monster, this creature, serve as sort of an external projection of sort of this internal conflict of the individual. And somehow by conquering that external monster, that creature, they can conquer what holds them back. And that very much is a part of what we find in Lucia de Lammermoor, and how Salvador Camarano takes that idea of the Gothic sublime. And that's sort of defined here in the context of Lucia, where she, in a sense, by turning into a world of madness and instability, that sort of allows her to escape the world. She conquers the very thing that holds her captive. And by becoming basically a mad woman, she is able to engage directly with that person who she desires to be, free from the bondages of the external world. So you can almost see this work as many scholars have shown, sort of this idea of a sort of a feminist sort of voice, where the woman is able to take back her control. But at the end of the day, this is men talking about women. So we'll be talking about this especially when we get to the world of science and the world of hysteria, which is a fascinating area of discussion in the 19th century and an area of disease. So just to give you a little bit about the story and the setting. The setting of the opera takes place roughly around the early part of the 18th century, around 1707. This is around the time when England and Scotland become the United Kingdom. And then we have Queen Anne becoming basically the monarch of England. And the two family rivals here, the Ravenswood and the Ashtons, basically they are part of this political sort of background that we have, sort of makes this sort of a historical novel set in a real time, but with characters that sort of plot sort of a new reality around that time. So the Ravenswood, one rival family, supports Queen Anne, while the Ashtons support a rival monarch to Queen Anne. So that's sort of the backdrop. And the Ashtons have put all their sort of hope and desire on this rival to Queen Anne. And this is one of the reasons why they're sort of in a dire strait, that they need to change their fortunes, because politically they have no capital. And also they're finding that they basically have spent all the resources that they have within their land. So just talk a little bit about the world of the story itself. And I just don't want to just presume that everyone knows the story, but it's filled with so many details, and there's a wonderful guide, as you all know, to this opera that have been put out by the education department. And I really encourage you to take a look, because there's so much detail there. But I'll just capture the highlights. This is an opera, a tragic opera in 3 acts. The first act, it begins with the idea of a hunting scene. And here we have the brother of Lucia. He's basically the head of the household. All the family members are dead, and all we have is the brother and basically his sister, Lucia. And their brother is with a hunting party looking for someone who came upon their land. And they're trying to figure out what's going on, who's this intruder on our land, and they come to realize it's a Ravenswood. It's Eduardo, who actually happens to be Lucia's lover. a little bit of drama there. You hear the sound of the music, the drama. And so that's the opening scene. And then we move directly into Lucia, who comes onto the scene, and she's a young woman who's frail, who looks pale, and even her handmaiden says that, you don't seem like you're exactly feeling okay. And sort of the background is that some people saying that, well, she's mourning the loss of her mother. But in any case, she appears on the scene. The first time we see her, there in Act 1, she's looking rather frail, and she's waiting for Eduardo. And her handmaiden is saying, you shouldn't be here. This is not right. But then Lucia says, in response to that, well, this fountain right here, this ancestral fountain, our own ancestral fountain, I saw a ghost. And she talks about this ghost that basically a relative of a former relative who was in love with a Ravenswood, who was killed by a Ravenswood, and the ghost beckons to her, almost something like Hamlet. She sees the ghost, and she's the only one who sees it, and somehow that ghost is speaking to her and telling her. And then the handmaiden, hearing the story, is like, okay, this truly says you should get involved in this. In any case, Eduardo appears, and they have a love duet, one of the great love duets from the opera. And they're at that fountain, that special fountain. They exchange these rings. And by exchanging the rings, they're saying, under the mantle of heaven, we are now united. So you can already get a sense, these things are in extremes. And this is really the hard part of Romanticism. It's always defining the world of things that go outside of the everyday and making it a part of the everyday. With my students, I always talk about that idea, almost as if you were to put telescopes or a microscope on your eyeballs. If you had to put a telescope on your eyeball and try to go from point A, from one edge of the room to the other, how large would it be? And that's basically defining your everyday. So it's things defining the everyday by the extreme, and creating that world that's part of making that extreme world part of your everyday. So after they exchange rings, we move into Act 2, and there in Act 2 we have Enrico, who is the brother of Lucia, who finds out that Lucia is involved with Eduardo, and so decides to forge a letter in Eduardo's hand, and because he of course doesn't want her to be involved with a rival member of the family of the Ravenswood. He actually has his own desires. He wants Lucia basically to marry an older man who has lots of wealth, so to redefine their fortunes. And so the purpose of Lucia for the brother is simply for marriage. And it's not out of love, it's not out of desire of anything, but simply to put her in a position to redouble the fortunes of the family. Enrico shows Lucia this letter, and she is at first doesn't believe it, but then the priest speaks to her and tells her, convinces her that this is the way to go, marry this older man. Eventually, we move into, at the end of Act 2, where we have the marriage ceremony, where they sit down to sign the certificate of marriage between this older man and Lucia. Lucia is feeling, and in the libretto it says she's shaking, she doesn't know what to do, she's feeling disoriented. So all along we're seeing that she's becoming more and more less there in a sense. She's becoming more and more sort of detached from her world. And as she's signing the contract, of course, the doors swing open, and Eduardo appears and accuses her of infidelity. And of course, Lucia reacts in a very strong way. He takes off his ring, does Eduardo, the one they exchanged, the fountain, and throws it at Lucia. And there, Lucia, of course, feeling completely despondent. And in that moment, we have the wonderful sextet, which just began our opening here. The sextet becomes a really wonderful opportunity here. The older lover, Lucia, as well as her handmaiden, as well as Enrico, Eduardo, and the priest. All of them there sort of responding in their own perspective on this in scene where this lover, this rival of the family, comes and approaches Lucia. At the end of the scene, what we have is Eduardo, the lover of Lucia, and Enrico, the brother of Lucia, basically challenge a duel. So they say the next day, what you did here at my family's celebration of this wedding was beyond the pale, and I challenge you to a duel. And the lover, Eduardo, agrees to meet the next day. Moving us into Act 3, what we have is the marriage ceremony, the sort of the party afterwards. Everyone is downstairs drinking, dancing, celebrating, and then all of a sudden you see the priest sort of with wide-eyed and saying, I can't believe what just happened. The husband is dead, and Lucia killed him. And so then Lucia appears, white dress, blood spattered, dagger in hand, dripping with her victim's blood, and basically says, hey, I love the sound of Eduardo. Where's my husband? He's the one I want. And everyone is transfixed by this mad scene. For about 25 minutes, what we have is Lucia at the center of the stage, where everyone is trying to figure out what just happened. And she just killed someone. And then eventually at the end of our opera, what we have is after the scene, she basically falls limp and she dies the next day. And they have a funeral service for her. And in the context, in the background of this funeral as it's proceeding, we have the duel on a high hill, and Enrico throws himself on Eduardo's sword and commits suicide. And there in death, a la Romeo and Juliet, Eduardo and Lucia can be together. So that gives you sort of a dramatic reading, if you will, of the story of Lucia. But you can see it's filled with so many interesting things and ties directly into ideas of Shakespeare, and also with ideas associated with the romantic, the world of the extreme being seen as part of the everyday, and seeing that as part of the dramatic sort of engagement with these characters. So just a few things I wanted to mention after this summary, just to talk a little bit about romantic opera and how we got to this sort of genre in relationship to how Lucia is defining herself. So in the 18th century, we had something known as opera buffa, or comic opera. And it's sort of, think of this sort of like the world of, let's say, situation comedy, very formulaic, sort of like Seinfeld. And those of you who have ever seen Seinfeld, you know, when Kramer opens the door, you're like, okay, we know he's going to say, he gets a laugh even before he steps into the room, because you know what's going to happen. It's Kramer, right? And so the thing about opera buffa, it uses these stereotyped characters. They put them in voice types, like basso buffo, or like the comic bass, where as soon as Kramer opens, basso buffo, you hear the music, you know it's full, you know it's a comic, or basso profundo, a serious bass, or a father figure. And what we have in Lucia is the lyric soprano, the light voice, and typically it's a young girl or young woman who is yet to define herself in the world. So not necessarily world weary, which would be some more of a dramatic soprano, but someone who is still yet to define themselves. So the character type, the voice type, coming from opera buffa. And what we find in the 19th century, it takes that voice type and makes it more dynamic. And so not just fixed by this stock sort of reality, but become something developing and becoming. Almost think of it like a drama that you might find on television, sort of like a police drama, where the characters are fixed within certain roles that they have to play, but they're always dynamic, looking for potential to develop and grow. And that potential, once again, centers itself around the voice. And this is the world of bel canto. Bel canto, there's so much to say about this idea, but basically in Italian means beautifully sung. And the idea of the voice becomes something more than just sort of a presentation or performance. The voice becomes almost an entity on its own right, sort of like a vehicle, an essence. And it's really at the heart of this term virtuoso. Now, the virtuoso comes from the Baroque period, but really kicks on sort of the timbre of the Romantic world here in the 19th century, that sound color. A virtuoso, you know, the root word here is virtue or essence or truth, and where the individual, the performer, transcends the instrument, transcends the technique. So what you hear is not Franz Liszt on the piano. You don't hear the piano, but you hear Franz Liszt. You don't hear the guitar, Jimi Hendrix. You hear Jimi Hendrix. What you hear in a virtuoso is that they transcend all the elements that challenge us, you know, in terms of creating music, all the challenges of making music happen. The individual transcends that. And what we have is sort of the essence, the truth of who they are, the spirit of who they are being defined directly within the sound. And that's the idea of bel canto here in the 19th century. And to demonstrate this, what I would like to do is have Dan play a video this is from Britain's Got Talent, of all things, in 2007, Paul Potts. And what we have in this video is him presenting Nessun Dorma. This is from the opera, of course, by Puccini Turandot. And this is 1926 when this was premiered. So it's a much heavier voice. This is basically what you find for a dramatic tenor. But what I find interesting about this, as he presents this, you know, No One Sleeps from that opera from Turandot, is this very idea of the bel canto, where it transcends the idea of the body and becomes an entity on its own right. All right, Dan, play the video.
What are you here for today, Paul?
To sing opera. I've always wanted to sing as a career. Confidence has always been sort of like a difficult thing for me. I've always found it a little bit difficult to be completely confident in myself.
Okay, ready when you are. you work at Carphone Warehouse, and you did that. I wasn't expecting that.
No, neither was I.
This was a complete breath of fresh air. I thought you were absolutely fantastic.
I just love that video. It always gives me goosebumps. You know, I don't know. It's just he sells car phones, and he always dreamed of singing opera. And you hear in his voice where he transcends. You know, you look at him and you think, oh, this is not an opera singer. What does he think he's doing? And the voice becomes something. You look at him now with your eyes melt. It's just, and that's sort of the beauty of bel canto. That's the idea of the virtuoso, the sense where it transcends the technique. And what you hear is the voice becoming an essence, a body, a spirit of the character themselves. One of the things we're going to move now is to Lucia and see how Natalie Dessay sings this element of the bel canto, the virtuosic idea here in the mad scene from Act 3. And we'll be talking more, of course, about the idea of madness, but also the elements that's defined here. So just listen once again to that idea of the voice becoming sort of an entity. So don't just listen to it as, oh, it's a nice person singing, but rather the idea that this represents the embodiment of the individual themselves, as if the voice becomes an entity to actually engage with, not just the physicality of the performer. All right, Dan, if you could play that clip. That's great. Yeah. No, it's just really a wonderful moment. And it's just curious is that this is when in the aria, this is second, it's that 25-minute sort of scene as I was mentioning. And this is the double aria. So that's the second part of the aria that we're talking about. And there she's talking about this idea to be so great when I'm in heaven and you're looking at my body crying over it and me looking at down here and waiting for you to arrive. This is all major happy music, but at the same time, the text is filled with something that is somewhat, rather macabre. So, and all this idea of the voice becoming this entity, this virtuosic sort of presence, and that's very much, of course, the idea, the medium, the whole point of opera is really to highlight the idea of the voice. But to frame the voice, of course, we have the orchestra. And the orchestra serves as this omniscient narrator. And think of that in the 19th century, more so than ever any other time with opera. The orchestra serves as this is a sort of sense to give a sense when the character's on stage and saying something, we can trust the orchestra. The orchestra is telling us, well, don't trust this guy, what he's saying. It gives us a true sense of sort of the truth of the character. And so it's omniscient. So it knows the past, it knows the present, and knows what will happen. And that begins really in a large part, just even in the overture itself. And what we're going to do is just play a little clip from the overture. It's only about 2 minutes or so. And what's interesting about this overture is that it gives us a foreshadowing. So like if you've ever seen a film, and this is what I often use in my students, the idea of the overture itself, see it as sort of the introduction to the one of these Marvel films, or even Star Wars Superman, that wonderful film. by Mario Puzo, and that idea where the music sort of gives us the sense of the spirit, the energy, the ideas, the emotion, and what you're about to experience in the next 2 hours or so. And that's very much what we have here in the overture. And of course, opera would set the tone for film later on. And so what we have is a foreshadowing of Lucia's death. We hear the funereal music, which starts in a very low, it's almost like a whisper, almost barely heard. And in the score, it doesn't just say piano, it's not just say pianissimo, almost a barely faint pianissimo. So it's so quiet, and it's a timpani representing the idea of a heartbeat. And then extreme sound of going to the extreme loud on the other end. So listen for the sounds of the orchestra, listening directly for this, what is sometimes referred as the umbra sound or the shadow sound, where we have the low brass playing the sound of a funeral march. And then also listen for a sudden surge in the music to represent the idea of fright and scare, to create the sense of trepidation. And it's done at a point, and this is one thing of the romantic sound that this opera so readily presents, is the idea of the liminal space. You know, when you're listening to something very high, you know, it's like, oh, I can't hear any more. And that's what the romantic opera tries to do, or especially romantic music tries to do in the orchestra, try to represent the very height. So almost a point where it responds directly physically to you, where you're almost sort of cowering away. And that's very much what we hear in the shrieks in the sound of the overture. So Dan, go ahead and play this foreshadowing music to Lucia. Right there, yeah. So you get a sense that, so this is how the opera begins, and so a totally different world than the Merry Widow, right? This brings you right into that Gothic, tragic, the Lammermoor, this region of the moors where raised, where the water settles, desolate area, and very much defining this world of this funeral going by, almost once again like Hamlet, like the funeral of Ophelia. So there's a lot of elements here that sort of highlight that world of the Gothic, and the world also perhaps of Shakespeare being defined by Salvador Camerano's libretto. So the orchestra, you could definitely is this narrator that helps to give us a sense of not only what the character is, sort of accompanying the character, gives a sense of the present, the future, of course, as the past. But especially in Lucia, it helps to frame her madness, this idea of her mental instability. And what's interesting is that Donizetti decided to set this mad scene in here in Act 3 to the use of a particular timbre, the use of a glass harmonica. And let me just show this instrument. And there's our Nally de Se. This glass harmonica, now this was something dating back to really ancient times, the idea of having water in particular in a glass and having raised at certain levels and creating different pitches. Benjamin Franklin was the one who decided to put it basically on a stick, different shapes of these bowls, and having a mechanism for the foot to have it turn. And then rubbing your hands in water and then being able to change the pitches. So what makes this instrument interesting and why Donizetti chose it is that this instrument is filled and laden with so many ideas associated with the medical history in Europe in the late 18th, early 19th century. Also the idea of supernatural and all these different elements that seem to highlight a world of the unknown being revealed in front of us. Now, I just wanted to demonstrate a little bit about what is this thing of the glass harmonica, and I have a presentation piece to show. This is a singing bowl. Now, the singing bowl, like the gong, and also like the glass harmonica, there are idiophones, or instruments that produce sound as you smack or strike or rub them together. And what's interesting about these instruments, the gong, the glass harmonica, and here the singing bowl, what makes them interesting is that they're at a fundamental pitch of 1 to 4 kilohertz. Why that is significant is that physically in our ears, that creates a challenge for us to locate the sound source to a point where we feel as if we can't find where the instrument is being heard. So if you hear a gong in a room, it's difficult to hear where exactly that gong was being played. Same thing with the glass harmonica and also the singing bowl. And what that seems to create is a sense almost as if the world of the unseen world is opening up, as if we're hearing the unknown, the unnatural, the world, basically the supernatural revealing itself. So hence these instruments were used to highlight the supernatural, often being defined in a way to represent the idea of the world of ghosts or the world of the unseen, where you see a shadow in the corner of your eye, it's like, and that's the world that's being opened up here. And so just to demonstrate here, and we hear in the glass harmonica, here the singing bowl, and this is a wonderful one that was given to me. And here you can as you can hear, it creates a sound of almost this constant building and building and building of pitch to a point where it creates this a sense of nervous agility. And that's exactly sort of the reality of this instrument. And just to just talk a little bit about its history itself. So in the late 18th century, it was often played, actually Mozart played this instrument, as did Benjamin Franklin. Mozart actually wrote pieces for it. And it was seen as an instrument, and actually when Benjamin Franklin developed this new way of performing it, Thomas Jefferson actually wrote to Benjamin Franklin, said, this can be a great instrument to compete with the pianoforte. This can be the American pianoforte. It never caught on, unfortunately, but this was sort of the thinking, that industrial time, thinking that we can patent this and we can turn this into an instrument associated with America, as Benjamin Franklin was there in Paris already as an ambassador trying to drum up support for the American Revolution. So he was already sort of thinking about ways to put America on the map. And so this instrument, this glass harmonica, often played by women, and it was seen as an instrument, once again, that created a sense of nervous tension, to a point where eventually we have the Dr. Franz Anton Mesmer, a Viennese doctor, which became known, of course, many of you know, mesmerism. He invented this idea where feeling that individuals who are emotionally and physically ill have a blockage. And that blockage can be it can be let go, it can be sort of realized out through the power of magnets and through the power of the glass harmonica. So what he believes that individual would drink sort of a liquid that's filled with, so often with iron shards, and then would have lodestones, magnets, put in various places of their body. And then, as you see at the bottom of this page, have the glass harmonica. The glass harmonica, as you see it sort of rippled, I don't know if you can see it there, rippled in the different size bowls, would play that, and that somehow would bring the person into a crisis. Think of a fever, where you heighten fever and the fever breaks and then healing occurs. That was the goal of Mesmer, to try to bring the people into a crisis, which often would lead into a sleep. This eventually is taken up by doctors in the latter part of the 19th century, like Charcot, but also Sigmund Freud, who eventually becomes hypnotism and somnambulism, or the idea of sleepwalking. So bringing someone into that sort of somnambulic state through the glass harmonica. So this instrument is infused with so many things, the idea associated with the supernatural, the sound of the nervous agility, the idea of medical practice to bring someone into a crisis sleep, to basically enact healing. So Donizetti chose this instrument with that particular purpose, to engage directly, as we only hear it here in Act 3. And Lucia sings this moment where it says, this sweet sound. And then that's the cue for the glass harmonica. So what we're hearing is what is in her head. Everyone on stage, what they're hearing is basically her. But us in the audience, we're hearing the sound of what's inside of her. So it's almost this form of diagnostic listening, almost like the idea, and use another visual aid, if I can, another visual aid, almost like the idea of a stethoscope, and which was invented in the early 19th century and was seen as a very clear way for individuals to understand that there are latent sounds that define the health of the body, that we can actually probe the external world being heard with the stethoscope, the probe from the outside, the internal world, and decipher these sounds to refer to health. And that translates directly into the world here of hearing illness and disease on the stage. So already people were already used to hearing sounds of illness in music, or hearing the sound of illness as something to be deciphered, as something that speaks to ideas of health. So what we're just going to hear is just a little snippet of the Glass Harmonica. What we have is Thomas Bloch, one of the great virtuoso Glass Harmonica players, and often he's contracted to play the Glass Harmonica with many opera companies for this particular moment in Lucia. So Dan, could you play that? Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so a very eerie sound, and that's when we hear it right there in that very moment. So truth must be told here, though. When this was originally premiered there in September 26, 1835, the Glass Harmonica player was actually fighting his contract there in Naples. This is what my colleague Roger Parker argues, that there was a record of the fact of a contract dispute with the Glass Harmonica player there and in the theater. And so we had to use a flute. And that continually is now being used as the instrument that defines this moment where she hears this sweet sound. And what we're about to hear is about the clip, is that clip right from Lucia di Lammermoor, where that sweet sound, we hear sort of the diagnostic form of listening, where we hear the inner sound of Lucia herself. We hear the sound that she hears, while the people on stage basically just see her. So it's almost this form where she becomes like a ghost to the people there on stage. And they actually say that when she enters in, she's like the ghost, she's like a grave. She doesn't seem to be here. She's pale. She doesn't seem like she's actually amongst us. And in fact, sonically speaking, she's not. She's like the audience. We're seeing the opera. We're hearing the sound within her. So you can see all the different layers sonically that Donizetti's trying to play out in this part. Also, what's interesting is that the music that represents this opening part of the mad scene aria, the first part, El Dolce Suono, the sweet sound, where she talks about Guardo, the music is from Act 1, when she tells her handmaiden of the ghost that haunts this fountain. And the words of that opening part: at dead of night, in the silent darkness, a pallid ray of airy moonlight fell upon the fountain, when a low moan was heard on the breeze, and there on the verge, a specter appeared before me. So that's the music from Act 1. And here she appears, blood-soaked, white wedding dress, dagger in hand, and saying, I see her sweet sound that we only hear, and the people on stage, the chorus, do not. All right, so Dan, can you play that? This is Natalie Dessay. we might have to cut it off right there. Due to time. Yeah, thanks. It's really, really, Natalie to say she's one of the greatest singers I think it's singing. That she's a wonderful actor in portraying this sad woman who's in this situation here, and it's such a ghast. And many people have argued that this mad scene is one where the music doesn't seem all that mad. It seems very sort of, it's balanced harmonically. The phrases are very square. So what is really mad about it? What makes it mad is what she's singing and how she looks and how this is all sort of leading up to this point. So, how did we get here? And this is the idea about female madness here in the 19th century. And what's curious about this opera is that unlike other operas, and there were several operas around this time in the 1830s that had mad women on stage. It was almost as if bel canto meant mad woman at the end. And they would always snap into madness, never in the sense where we see with Lucia. From the very beginning, people are saying, she doesn't look right. She looks pale. She doesn't seem like she is doing okay. They continue to diagnose her. And so when she comes to the end, we already have a sense that this is what's going to happen here. It's no surprise. But the very fact that she kills, we never have a mad woman who kills. And the fact that we have her create this androcide, this idea of murder of her husband, this was seen as a traitorous act, a criminal, insane act. If a woman killed her husband, she'd be put directly into a mental institution and often killed because it was seen as a traitorous act because the head of the household was seen as the head of the state. And so by killing your husband, in a sense, you're an act, a civil disobedience against the state. So it's seen as a traitor, not only to the state, but also to the family. And so it was, so we have a mad woman who kills her husband, and she's on stage, blood-soaked with his, showcasing directly her act. So that very aspect is one of the main reasons why this opera was not well appreciated. This mad scene was not well appreciated in the first couple decades after it premiered in 1835. Many people actually try to avoid that particular moment, that scene. Actually, when this opera was used for the salon, little snippets taken from the opera so people can play in their home, that scene was not taken. It was the love duet in Act 1, or it was the sextet in Act 2, or the duel that occurs after this mad scene between Enrico and Eduardo, where Eduardo tells about his love for Lucia and his regret. So those are the elements that found their way in the salon postcards from this opera, not the mad scene. Perhaps there's something about this mad scene, especially in the 1830s, that many people saw was way too close, and the fact that she commits murder also enhances that as well. And so I'm just going to share my screen just to talk a little bit about madness here in the 19th century and be wrapping up, and so we can maybe start some questions. Now, female madness, and is to be understood, it was seen as a symptom of hysteria, which was a particularly disease for women. We had hypochondria, which was the madness, symptom of madness that was found in men. And both hysteria and hypochondria were defined, the cure for both was seen as marriage or intercourse, basically. It was seen as that was an opportunity for them to be defined back within the social codes of the day. For someone who avoided marriage, basically hysteria was something that could be enabled within that individual. It's a very odd way of thinking, socially defined, but also was seen as defining itself physically. And so people would actually go to these houses where the mentally ill, hysterical women were defined, and they would see it as moral instruction. People would buy tickets to see these performances, which was really quite stunning, that they would come to see these individuals in their state in hopes to sort of get a sense that this is the reason why they're there. This is the reason that gives us a sense of why society is formed the way it is, to detail to us that this is where they should be kept aside. So it was a form of moral instruction where you would actually have families with young children going into these spaces to directly engage that. And this was something quite common here in the 1830s and 40s. And so we have these areas of the mentally ill where people would go to, and then having this on the stage of the opera also further highlighted that. And where you had individuals writing treatises directly about the ideas of the hysteric victims and indicating plates of the patients, of the individuals as well. So it was a time where mental illness was very much a part of the everyday world that people would engage in, especially the world of hysteria. So I think we're going to leave it there and have an opportunity. Thank you for all of your rapt attention. I've seen some of your face. You're like, whoa, that's crazy. But hopefully it found some interesting insights for all of you as you approach this opera.
Dr. Mark Pottinger, that is fascinating. I took so many amazing notes. The Glass Harmonica, who knew? So if you can hang, it'd be so great when we have our sort of wrap up and reflection. We'd love to, maybe get some of those questions answered.
Definitely.
But thank you, Dr. Mark Pottinger. One of the great sadnesses about the virtual context is we can't, after people like that present, we can't walk up to them, shake their hands and say, that rocked my world. So let me say it virtually on behalf of everyone that rocked our worlds.